If you stand in the trading pits of the New York Mercantile Exchange today, you will witness the heartbeat of global power. You will see traders screaming numbers that determine the fate of nations. You will see screens flickering with prices denominated in one currency and one currency only, the currency that every country on Earth must acquire before it can participate in the modern economy. You will see the machinery of an empire that conquered the world without firing a shot at its rivals. This is not merely a commodities market. This is the control room of American invincibility. In the autumn of 1973, the United States faced what appeared to be total economic catastrophe. The dollar had been severed from gold just 2 years earlier. Inflation was spiraling out of control, eating away at the savings of ordinary Americans. Arab nations had imposed an oil embargo that was strangling the American economy with every passing day. Gas lines stretched for miles in cities across the nation. The stock market was collapsing in one of its worst bear markets since the Great Depression. Every economic indicator suggested that America was about to experience a financial reckoning that would end its superpower status permanently. The rules of economics that governed every other nation on Earth were closing in on the United States like a steel trap. They believed America was finished. They believed the dollar would collapse into worthlessness like the currencies of banana republics and defeated powers. They believed the era of American dominance was ending in gasoline shortages and stagflation and national humiliation. They did not understand what was about to happen in the desert palaces of Saudi Arabia. They did not see the deal being constructed in absolute secrecy that would make America immune to the laws of economics that governed everyone else. This is the story of the agreement that made America untouchable. It was not a treaty ratified by Congress. It was not a law passed by any legislature on Earth. It was a handshake deal between American diplomats and Arabian princes that rewrote the fundamental rules of global finance forever. It created a system where attacking America economically meant attacking yourself. It built an invisible fortress around the dollar that has withstood every challenge for half a century. And the men who designed it understood exactly what they were creating, a mechanism of control so elegant, so invisible that most people would never know it existed. To understand how America became untouchable, we must first understand how close it came to complete destruction. The Bretton Woods system that emerged from World War II had placed the United States at the very center of global finance. The dollar was backed by gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other currency in the world was pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. America was the banker to the world, the guarantor of monetary stability, the anchor of the entire international economic order. It was a position of extraordinary privilege that no nation had ever held before. It was also a position of extraordinary vulnerability that few understood at the time. The system contained a fatal mathematical flaw that became apparent over 2 decades of Cold War spending. The United States was printing more dollars than it possessed gold to redeem them. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe cost billions. The Korean War cost billions more. The Vietnam War consumed tens of billions. The space race, the highway system, the Great Society programs that promised to eliminate poverty, all of them required money that America did not actually possess. By the late 1960s, foreign governments had accumulated far more dollar claims than there was gold in Fort Knox to honor. The mathematics were inexorable. The French government, under President Charles de Gaulle, began systematically converting its dollar reserves to physical gold, sending naval vessels across the Atlantic to collect the metal from the New York Federal Reserve. It was a slow-motion bank run on the United States Treasury. Between 1958 and 1971, American gold reserves fell from $22 billion to barely $10 billion. At the rate foreign governments were demanding gold, the vaults would be completely empty within 2 years. Treasury Secretary John Connally watched the numbers with growing alarm from his office in Washington. He understood that when the gold ran out, the dollar would collapse overnight. The United States would face the same humiliation that had destroyed the British pound in 1967, when Britain was forced to devalue and accept loans from the International Monetary Fund. American hegemony would end not with a heroic battle, but with an accountant's ledger. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television in an address that interrupted the popular Western program Bonanza and announced that the United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold. He called it a temporary measure to protect America from speculators. He called it a defensive action against those who were attacking the dollar unfairly. Everyone who understood international finance knew it was permanent. Everyone knew it was an admission of insolvency. The sacred promise that had anchored the global economy for 27 years had been broken with a Sunday night television address. The dollar was now backed by nothing but faith and habit. The markets reacted with appropriate terror in the weeks that followed. The dollar plunged against other major currencies. Inflation, already running dangerously high, began accelerating toward double digits. The price of everything Americans needed to buy from abroad rose dramatically. But the real crisis was still approaching. It would arrive 2 years later, in the form of an oil embargo that would expose just how vulnerable America had become. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a massive coordinated attack on Israel during the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, nearly overwhelming Israeli defenses in the first days of fighting. The United States began an emergency airlift of weapons and ammunition to save the Jewish state from potential destruction. The Arab members of OPEC retaliated with fury at this American intervention. On October 17, they announced a complete oil embargo against the United States and its allies. They simultaneously announced production cuts that would reduce global supply by 5% per month until their demands were met. The American economy convulsed as if struck by a hammer. Gas stations ran dry across the country. Factories closed for lack of fuel. The stock market lost nearly half its value in one of the worst crashes since 1929. Inflation and unemployment rose simultaneously, a phenomenon economists had believed was theoretically impossible, which they christened with the new term stagflation. The United States appeared to be experiencing the accumulated consequences of 2 decades of fiscal irresponsibility all at once. Every rule of economics suggested that America was about to fall permanently from its position as the world's dominant power. But in the chaos, one man saw something that others had missed entirely. Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, understood that the oil embargo had revealed a truth far more important than the immediate damage it was causing. Oil was now the most important commodity on Earth, more important than gold or steel or any other raw material. Whoever controlled the terms of oil trade would control the global economy itself. And if the dollar could be made essential to buying oil, then the dollar would be essential to absolutely everything else. The crisis was not a death sentence for American power. It was an unprecedented opportunity to build something more powerful than the gold standard had ever been. Henry Kissinger was not an economist by training or temperament. He was a strategist, a student of Metternich and Bismarck and the great power politics of the 19th century, a man who thought in terms of leverage and balance of power rather than interest rates and monetary aggregates. He looked at the oil embargo and saw not an economic problem requiring economic solutions, but a geopolitical puzzle that could be solved with diplomacy. The Arabs had demonstrated that they possessed an extraordinary weapon. The question Kissinger asked himself was how to neutralize that weapon while simultaneously turning it to permanent American advantage. The answer he developed over the following months would reshape the entire architecture of global power. The key to Kissinger's strategy was Saudi Arabia. The kingdom sat atop the largest proven oil reserves anywhere on Earth. It was the swing producer that could raise or lower global prices at will simply by adjusting the flow through its pipelines. But the House of Saud was also deeply vulnerable despite its vast wealth. The royal family ruled over a population that was largely poor, tribal, and religiously conservative. The regime had enemies on every side. Revolutionary Arab nationalists in Egypt who dreamed of pan-Arab unity, hostile Ba'athist governments in Iraq and Syria, the expansionist Shah of Iran building his military with American weapons, domestic radicals who considered the royal family corrupt puppets of the West. The Saudis needed protection. They needed weapons. They needed an ironclad guarantee that the most powerful military force on Earth would defend their throne against any threat. Kissinger offered them exactly what they needed most. In a series of secret negotiations throughout 1974, conducted far from the prying eyes of Congress and the press, he constructed a deal that would bind Saudi Arabia and the United States together in a relationship of permanent mutual dependency. Terms were elegant in their simplicity and revolutionary in their implications. The United States would provide unlimited military support to the Saudi regime in perpetuity. American weapons, American military training, American intelligence sharing, and an implicit promise of direct American military intervention would shield the House of Saud against any conceivable threat, foreign or domestic. In exchange, Saudi Arabia would agree to 2 conditions that would transform global finance forever. First, all Saudi oil exports would be priced exclusively in United States dollars. No other currency would ever be accepted for Saudi petroleum. Any country anywhere in the world that wanted to buy Saudi oil, and every industrial country on earth desperately needed Saudi oil, would first have to acquire dollars. Second, the Saudis would invest their surplus oil revenues in American Treasury securities and deposits in American banks. The petrodollars that would flood into Riyadh from oil sales would flow right back to New York and Washington as investments in American government debt. The Saudis would finance American deficits, while America protected the Saudi throne. Each side would become essential to the other. Think about the strategic genius of this arrangement for a moment. Under the old gold standard, the dollar's value depended entirely on the metal sitting in the vaults of Fort Knox. Foreign governments could demand that metal at any time they chose, for any reason or no reason. The system was inherently unstable because the gold was finite, and the claims accumulating against it were essentially infinite, as America kept printing money to fund its ambitions. But under the petrodollar system Kissinger was constructing, the dollar's value would depend on something far more powerful than gold. It would depend on necessity itself. Oil was not a luxury that countries could choose to forego. It was the essential commodity without which modern industrial civilization simply could not function. Every factory, every vehicle, every power plant, every military machine, every airplane and ship and truck ran on petroleum. By making the dollar essential to buying oil, Kissinger had discovered a way to make the dollar essential to existence itself. The formal agreement was signed in June 1974 under the deliberately innocuous title of the United States-Saudi Arabian Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation. The published documents that emerged from the signing ceremony spoke blandly of development assistance and trade promotion and technical cooperation. The secret protocols that were never released to the public or to Congress contained the real substance of the arrangement. Oil priced in dollars, surplus revenues invested in American treasuries, military protection provided forever. Within 2 years of the Saudi deal, every other OPEC member nation had adopted the same arrangement. They had no practical choice. Saudi Arabia controlled the largest share of global production and could flood or drain the market at will. If the Saudis priced their oil in dollars, everyone else had to price in dollars as well to remain competitive. The effect on global finance was immediate and transformative beyond what even Kissinger had anticipated. In 1973, global oil trade was worth approximately $20 billion annually. By 1980, after the Iranian Revolution triggered another massive price shock, it was worth $300 billion every year. Every single transaction, every barrel sold, required United States dollars. Every country that wanted to participate in the industrial economy had to maintain dollar reserves, had to trade with American financial institutions, had to accept American rules and American oversight. The United States had created a permanent, structural, inescapable demand for its currency that would exist as long as the world ran on oil. And in 1974, no one imagined that would ever change. But the deal accomplished something even more important than creating demand for dollars. It created a trap that would prevent any country from ever successfully challenging American financial hegemony. Consider the position of a major trading nation like Japan or Germany in the 1980s. They were accumulating billions upon billions of dollars from their persistent trade surpluses with the United States. They could not spend those dollars on American goods because American goods were often more expensive or less desirable than their own domestic products. They could not convert those dollars to gold because there was no gold window anymore. Nixon had slammed it shut in 1971. They could only invest those surplus dollars in American financial assets, treasury bonds, corporate stocks, bank deposits, real estate. They were lending America money with no practical way to ever get it back. And here was the genius of the trap Kissinger had built. The more dollars any country accumulated, the more that country depended on the dollar remaining stable and strong. If Japan had tried to dump its massive dollar holdings in the 1980s to punish America for some policy dispute, the dollar would have crashed, and so would the value of Japan's own remaining holdings. The Japanese had invested so heavily in American assets that attacking American financial dominance meant attacking themselves. They had become prisoners of their own export success, locked inside a golden cage constructed entirely from treasury securities and corporate bonds. The same inescapable logic applied to the oil exporters themselves, the very countries that had seemed so powerful during the embargo. Saudi Arabia accumulated hundreds of billions of dollars over the decades following the 1974 agreement. Those dollars went into American banks, American government bonds, American corporate stocks, American real estate in Manhattan and Los Angeles and Miami. The Saudi sovereign wealth funds grew to become some of the largest institutional investors in the American economy. If the Saudis had ever tried to abandon the dollar or diversify away from American assets, they would have destroyed the value of their own accumulated wealth. The jailers and the jailed had become impossible to distinguish from one another. The true test of America's invincibility came not in the oil fields of the Middle East, but in the bond markets of the 1980s. President Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981 with an economic agenda that would have bankrupted any other nation on Earth within a single decade. He proposed massive tax cuts that would reduce federal revenue by hundreds of billions of dollars over the coming years. He simultaneously proposed massive military spending increases to confront the Soviet Union in what he called a peace-through-strength strategy. He promised to balance the budget eventually through the magic of economic growth. The arithmetic did not work. Everyone who could add knew the arithmetic did not work. But Reagan proceeded anyway. The federal budget deficit exploded to levels that had no precedent in American peacetime history. In 1980, the deficit was $74 billion, already considered dangerously large by the economists of that era. By 1983, it had reached $200 billion. By 1986, it exceeded $220 billion. The national debt doubled during Reagan's first term and doubled again during his second. Traditional economic theory taught that such deficits should cause interest rates to spike, as the government crowded out private borrowers. Inflation should soar as too many dollars chased too few goods. The dollar should collapse as foreign investors fled American bonds for safer havens. The bond market should impose fiscal discipline on American policy just as it imposed discipline on every other government in the world. None of this happened. Interest rates fell throughout the 1980s after Paul Volcker broke the back of inflation. The dollar strengthened dramatically against other major currencies. Foreign investors did not flee American bonds. They purchased them in unprecedented quantities, practically fighting for the privilege of lending money to Washington. The Japanese bought hundreds of billions in Treasury securities. The Germans bought hundreds of billions more. Saudis and other Gulf states recycled their oil revenues into American debt exactly as the 1974 agreement specified. America was borrowing money at interest rates that defied all economic logic, and the world was lining up eagerly to lend. The petrodollar system had made this seeming impossibility possible. Every oil-importing nation needed dollars to purchase petroleum. They could only acquire dollars by selling goods to America or by purchasing American financial assets. The dollars they earned from exports flowed back to America as investments. The cycle was beautifully self-reinforcing. America ran trade deficits that provided foreigners with dollars. Foreigners used those dollars to buy American bonds that financed America's budget deficits. America used the borrowed money to consume more foreign goods and run larger trade deficits and provide more dollars for foreigners to invest. It was a perpetual motion machine powered by oil and lubricated by financial engineering. The Reagan deficits proved something that economists of the previous generation had considered theoretically impossible. The United States could borrow without any practical limit. The normal constraints that forced other governments to balance their budgets or face catastrophic consequences simply did not apply to America. Britain in the 1970s had been forced to accept humiliating conditions from the International Monetary Fund when its deficits grew too large. Mexico in 1982 defaulted on its sovereign debt and suffered a lost decade of economic devastation. Argentina, Brazil, and dozens of other countries learned the hard way what happened when you borrowed more than you could repay. But America could borrow trillions and face no consequences whatsoever. The petrodollar system had transformed American government debt into the safest asset in the world, not because American fiscal management was sound, but because the entire global economy had become dependent on the dollar remaining stable. The implications extended far beyond mere economics into the realm of military power and geopolitical dominance. American military capabilities, which had seemed constrained by budget realities under previous administrations, were now essentially unlimited as long as the world kept lending. The Reagan military buildup that ultimately broke the Soviet Union was financed not by American taxpayers alone, but by Japanese savers and Saudi princes and German exporters and every other nation that had no choice but to accumulate dollars and invest them somewhere safe. The $700 billion that went into stealth bombers and aircraft carriers and submarine fleets and missile defense research came from a world that was compelled by the petrodollar system to provide the financing. America could maintain a military larger than the next 10 countries combined because the world was paying for it. The petrodollar system did not merely make America wealthy. It made America immune to the consequences that had destroyed every other great power in history. Consider what happened to nations and leaders who dared to challenge the arrangement. In November 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin pricing its oil exports in euros rather than dollars. It was a largely symbolic gesture given Iraq's limited production capacity under sanctions, but the symbolism itself was profoundly dangerous to American interests. If Iraq could successfully abandon the dollar, others might follow. The euro was strengthening against the dollar. European politicians were openly discussing the possibility of creating an alternative to American financial hegemony. In March 2003, American and coalition forces invaded Iraq with overwhelming military power. The stated justifications included weapons of mass destruction, support for international terrorism, and the promotion of democracy in the Middle East. The weapons of mass destruction were never found. The terrorism connections were never definitively established. The democracy promotion produced a decade of sectarian violence and instability. But within weeks of the invasion, the coalition provisional authority that governed occupied Iraq reversed the country's euro policy and restored dollar pricing for all Iraqi oil exports. Whatever else the war accomplished or failed to accomplish, it accomplished this. The first serious challenge to the petrodollar system had been crushed with overwhelming military force. The lesson was not lost on other oil producers watching from their capitals. The pattern repeated itself with Libya less than a decade later. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi proposed creating a gold-backed pan-African currency called the gold dinar. It would be used to price African oil and other commodities, creating a genuine alternative to both the dollar and the euro for an entire continent. African nations would accumulate real gold rather than American paper promises. The proposal attracted interest from other African leaders who resented their dependence on Western financial systems. In 2011, NATO intervened militarily in Libya's civil war on the side of the rebels opposing Gaddafi's government. Within months, Gaddafi was dead, captured by rebel fighters and killed under circumstances that remain disputed. The gold dinar project died with him. Another challenge to American financial hegemony had been neutralized with extreme prejudice. The sequence of events was not coincidental. American strategists understood perfectly well that the petrodollar system was the true foundation of American power in the modern era. They understood that any successful alternative to dollar pricing of oil would undermine not just American currency, but the entire architecture of American global dominance. They responded to perceived threats with the full spectrum of American capabilities: diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, covert operations, and when those proved insufficient, direct military intervention. The price of challenging the dollar was measured in blood and national destruction. For America's ostensible allies, the system created a different kind of trap, one wrapped in the language of partnership and mutual benefit. Germany and Japan and South Korea and dozens of other countries ran persistent trade surpluses with the United States year after year, decade after decade, accumulating trillions of dollars in the process. They invested those dollars in American assets because there was simply no other viable option. They could not convert them to gold because the gold window remained permanently closed. They could not spend them domestically without causing inflation and disrupting their own economies. They could only lend them back to America, financing American consumption, American deficits, American military adventures around the world. They were paying tribute to an empire while maintaining the polite fiction that they were equal partners in an alliance. The 2008 financial crisis revealed just how untouchable America had truly become. The crisis originated entirely in American financial institutions that had created toxic mortgage securities and spread them throughout the global financial system through fraud, incompetence, and regulatory capture. By any reasonable standard of economic justice, America should have faced devastating consequences for triggering a worldwide depression. Instead, the opposite happened. When the crisis struck and panic spread through global markets, Money from around the world fled to American Treasury bonds as the safest haven available in a terrifying storm. The dollar actually strengthened against other currencies. American interest rates fell to historic lows. The country that had caused the crisis benefited enormously from the panic it had created. Think about the profound perversity of that outcome. American financial institutions had destroyed trillions of dollars in wealth through practices that ranged from negligent to criminal. The American government responded by borrowing trillions more to bail out those same institutions and stimulate the cratered economy. And the rest of the world paid for that bailout by lending America money at the lowest interest rates in recorded history. The arsonist was rewarded handsomely for starting the fire. The petrodollar system had created a moral hazard of truly planetary scale. By 2024, 50 years after the original deal was struck in Riyadh, the United States had accumulated over $34 trillion in national debt. No other nation in history had borrowed so much from so many for so long. No other nation could have borrowed so much without facing catastrophic consequences. The annual interest payments on this debt exceeded the entire military budgets of most countries on Earth. Yet the world continued lending. The Chinese held over $1 trillion in Treasury securities, despite open hostility and trade wars between Washington and Beijing. The Japanese held over $1 trillion more despite decades of their own economic stagnation. The Saudis remained heavily invested despite occasional diplomatic tensions and the murder of a journalist. They all remained invested because they had no realistic choice. The system that made America untouchable had made everyone else permanently trapped. The energy deal that made America untouchable is now entering its 6th decade. The basic architecture of the petrodollar system remains fundamentally intact. Oil is still predominantly priced in dollars. Surplus petrodollars still flow into American financial assets. American military power still protects the regimes that maintain the system. But the foundations are shifting in ways that would have been unimaginable to Kissinger and King Faisal when they concluded their secret negotiations in the palaces of Riyadh. China has become the world's largest importer of petroleum and has begun conducting some energy transactions in yuan through the Shanghai Exchange. Russia, expelled from Western financial systems by comprehensive sanctions after 2022, now accepts payment in rubles and rupees and yuan for its substantial energy exports. Saudi Arabia itself, the very cornerstone of the petrodollar edifice, has publicly entertained the possibility of accepting currencies other than the dollar for at least some portion of its oil sales. The BRICS nations have discussed creating entirely new payment systems that would bypass American banks and American oversight completely. The monopoly that seemed eternal is fraying visibly at the edges. More fundamentally, the world is beginning a transition away from the fossil fuels that gave the petrodollar system its power. The deal that made America untouchable was built on the foundational assumption that oil would remain essential forever, that no alternative source of energy could ever replace petroleum in the global economy. Climate change and rapid technological progress are now undermining that assumption. Electric vehicles outsell gasoline-powered cars in some major markets. Solar and wind power have become the cheapest sources of new electricity generation across most of the world. The black substance that anchored the dollar's dominance is slowly but unmistakably losing its central position in the global energy system. The story of the petrodollar teaches us a fundamental but uncomfortable truth about the nature of power. Invincibility is always temporary. The United States built an extraordinary system that protected it from the normal consequences of its own fiscal choices for half a century. It borrowed more money than any nation in history and faced no meaningful reckoning. It fought expensive wars without paying for them honestly. It consumed vastly more than it produced and called the arrangement prosperity. But the system depended entirely on oil remaining essential and the dollar remaining indispensable. Both assumptions are now being tested by forces beyond any government's control. Remember that every empire in history has believed its arrangements were permanent and its dominance was ordained by nature or providence. The British believed the pound sterling would dominate global trade forever. The Romans believed their coins would circulate for eternity. The Saudis and the Americans believed they had built a system that could withstand any challenge. History suggests that all such beliefs are eventually proven wrong. The question is not whether the petrodollar system will eventually end, but when and what will replace it, and whether America will manage the transition gracefully or be overwhelmed by it. The deal struck in the desert palaces of Riyadh in 1974 was not merely an agreement about oil prices and military protection between two governments. It was the construction of an invisible fortress around American power that has endured for half a century. It made the dollar indispensable to global commerce. It made American debt the safest asset in the world despite American fiscal irresponsibility. It made challenging American hegemony an act of economic self-destruction for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. If you understand the petrodollar system, you understand why America can borrow $34 trillion and still pay lower interest rates than countries with balanced budgets and sound finances. If you understand the petrodollar system, you understand why oil producers and trade surplus nations continue lending to America despite receiving negative real returns on their investments. If you understand the petrodollar system, you understand the hidden foundation upon which American power has rested for 2 generations. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic Historian Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.